The moment my son-in-law stood up at my daughter's birthday dinner and called me an embarrassment in front of 11 people, I made a quiet decision. Not a Duggan. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you announce. The kind you fold up carefully and put in your coat pocket for later. I want you to understand who I was before that dinner, so you understand who I became after it. My name is David Pearce. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years in commercial insurance, worked my way from claims adjuster to regional director, built a client portfolio that put 2 kids through university, and paid off a house in Oakville before I was 50. I am not a man who makes scenes. I am not a man who raises his voice at the dinner table. I am a man who, when the basement flooded the week before Christmas one year, went down there himself with a wet vac at midnight and didn't mention it again. I fixed things, quietly. That was the job I'd given myself, and I was very good at it. My daughter is Sylvia. She is 32, and she is the kind of person who fills every room she walks into. Not loudly. She just has that quality, that gravitational pull, that makes people turn toward her without realizing they've done it. I used to watch her at school concerts when she was 10, 12, 14, standing there under the gymnasium lights, and I would think, how did I produce someone like this? I was so proud of her I didn't have the right words for it. She married Colin Ashworth 4 years ago. They met at a work conference in Toronto, dated for a year and a half, got engaged on a trip to Tofino. I remember the call she made to tell me. Her voice was different, brighter, the kind of bright that only happens once. I liked Colin at first. He was sharp, good with people, had opinions about wine and hockey that he held with equal conviction. He was the kind of man who could talk to anyone. I respected that about him. I told Sylvia I thought she'd done well. I meant it. What I didn't understand yet was that Colin had a mother. Her name was Renata, and she arrived into my life the way certain weather systems arrive, gradually, and then all at once. She was 61, recently divorced, had the posture of a woman who considered disappointment a personal insult. She lived 40 minutes away in Burlington and treated that 40 minutes like a lifelong grievance against geography. Colin spoke to her every day, not occasionally, every single day. And Renata had opinions about things. About Sylvia's apartment, then Sylvia's house. About how they spent holidays. About where the money went and why. Colin would listen to all of it, and then Renata's opinions would find their way into conversations at dinner tables, worded differently, but recognizable. The way a tune sounds the same no matter who's humming it. My late wife, Carol, had seen it before I did. She had that gift. She'd mentioned it once, quietly, in the car driving home from a Christmas dinner. I told her she was reading too much into it. I was wrong. I am man enough to say that now. Carol died 3 years before the birthday dinner. Breast cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the end. The kind of timeline that doesn't leave room for much, except deciding what kind of person you're going to be about it. I was, by most accounts, okay. I kept going to work. I kept the house. I showed up to Sunday dinners at Sylvia and Colin's place, with a bottle of red and a reasonably accurate impression of a man who was fine. Sylvia knew better, but she loved me enough not to push it. What I didn't realize was that during the year after Carol died, something had shifted in the Ashworth household. With Carol gone, there was no longer anyone counterbalancing Renata. Carol had been gracious and firm in equal measure. She had a way of redirecting conversations without anyone feeling redirected. With her gone, Renata moved into the space Carol had occupied and redecorated it. The signs were small at first, individually nothing. Sylvia's birthday that year. Renata had organized the dinner she'd offered. Sylvia had accepted because Sylvia is generous like that, assumes good intent, gives people room to show up well. The reservation was at a restaurant in downtown Hamilton, Italian place, good food, reasonable noise level. I arrived exactly on time to find Renata already seated at the head of the table, Colin to her right. Sylvia pushed 2 seats down the way you push someone down when you're rearranging things for your own comfort and hoping they don't notice. I took my seat across from Colin's younger brother Gareth. Gareth was 28, still lived at home with Renata, and had the particular energy of someone who'd never had to hold an uncomfortable thought in his life. He was not unkind. He was simply, comprehensively, unaware of others. The other guests were Colin's Aunt Phyllis, 2 of Sylvia's friends from work, their partners, and a couple I'd never met who were apparently friends of Renata's from her book club. I mentioned the book club couple because they were given the seats closest to Renata and they were treated accordingly, referred to by first name, asked about their recent trip to Portugal, laughed at generously. I don't begrudge them that. I mention it because of what came next. When the wine was being ordered, Renata consulted with the book club couple, then with Colin, then with Gareth, who doesn't drink wine. Then she put the list down. I had not been asked. Our server looked at me. And for you, sir? Renata said. We've already decided, as though my question had been directed at her. Sylvia caught my eye from 2 seats down. She mouthed sorry. I smiled at her, told her with my face that it was nothing. Later, during the mains, conversation moved in the easy way dinner conversation does. Jobs, travel, a recent news story about housing prices, the particular sport of complaining about the 401 corridor. I'd made a comment about interest rates, something to do with my work, and Renata had waited the precise interval you wait when you want to make clear you've heard something and found it ignorable. And then she spoke to Phyllis about something else entirely. Phyllis at least looked vaguely apologetic. The birthday cake came out. Everyone sang. Sylvia laughed and covered her face the way she'd always done since she was little. The candles lit up her cheeks, and for a moment it was just the right kind of evening. Warm. My daughter laughing in candlelight. That's the part I held on to later. That moment existed and it mattered. Then Colin stood up to give a toast. He talked about Sylvia, about how she made their house feel like a home, about a small thing she'd done recently that he'd found unexpectedly moving. It was good, actually. I was glad to hear it. I was preparing to raise my glass when Colin added, and of course, Mum, none of this would have come together tonight without you. He looked at Renata. Renata accepted this with practiced modesty. There was a pause. The natural moment for Colin to acknowledge Sylvia's father, who was sitting at the table. He sat down. I raised my glass anyway because Sylvia deserved it and I drank. Gareth, to my left, leaned over with the casual cruelty of the genuinely oblivious. Colin doesn't really talk about you much, he said, not meanly, just observationally, the way someone comments on the weather. I think he finds it a bit, I don't know, difficult. He shrugged and reached for the breadbasket. I put my glass down and said nothing. 3 weeks later, I drove to Sylvia and Colin's for Sunday dinner. I'd brought groceries. Her favorite, a lamb shoulder. I'd been slow cooking this style since she was in high school. I knew their kitchen. I'd helped them pick out the appliances when they moved in. I let myself in through the side door they told me to use. Renata was already there. She was at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and she turned when I came in with the expression of a woman who had expected to be alone in the space she was occupying. Oh, she said. David, just like that. 2 syllables that contained an entire opinion. I said hello. I put the lamb in the oven. I set the timer I knew to set. The one on the wall, not the one on the microwave, because the microwave timer had been inconsistent for 8 months, and nobody had fixed it. Renata watched me do this with an expression I would describe as performed patience, like she was allowing something. During dinner, she referenced the lamb once, to say that she found it a touch overdone. Colin agreed. Sylvia said nothing and ate 2 servings. I noticed these things. I put them somewhere. Here's the piece of the picture I want you to hold on to, because it matters for everything that comes later. 18 months after Carol died, my brother-in-law, Carol's brother Malcolm, called me from Edmonton. He was going through Carol's things that had been in storage there. And he'd found something. A box of her papers, letters, some photos, some handwritten notes from when she was in her 20s. He mailed it to me, and I sat with it for an entire weekend. It is not an experience I will describe in detail, because some things do not need an audience. What I will tell you is that going through that box reminded me of something Carol used to say. She said, David, the problem with you is that you wait too long to act on what you already know. She was talking, at the time, about a leaking soffit we'd ignored for 2 seasons. But like most things Carol said, it applied more broadly. I started paying attention differently after that. The Sunday dinners continued. The pattern continued. The pattern of being spoken over continued. Of being introduced to Renata's friends as Sylvia's father, with a tone that implied modest expectations. Of having my professional background either misidentified Renata once referred to me as in finance or something like that to someone at a gathering, which is true only in the way that saying someone is in words or something like that describes a novelist. And then there was the conversation. Sylvia called me on a Tuesday evening in October. I could hear it in the first 2 seconds. The particular texture of her voice when she'd been thinking about something for too long without saying it. She talked around it for a few minutes, then said, "Dad, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest." "Always," I said. "Colin's mum has been saying some things." A pause. "To Colin. About you." She stopped. "What kind of things?" That since Mum died, you've been leaning on me too much. That you come over too often. That it puts pressure on our marriage. That Colin feels like you don't respect the boundaries of their home." I sat with that for a moment. "How many times have I been at your house in the past 2 months?" I asked. Silence. "Sylvia, how many times?" "4," she said quietly. "Maybe 5. And how often is Renata there?" The pause was longer. "That's different," she finally said. "Is it?" She didn't answer, but she hadn't hung up either, and that told me something. Colin's company Christmas party was in December, at a hotel in downtown Hamilton. Sylvia had invited me. There were partners, family members. It was that kind of event. Open bar, too much ambient music, the specific social geometry of a work party, where everyone is performing their best version of relaxed. I'd been to these before. I know how to navigate them. I was getting a drink at the bar, club soda. I don't drink much anymore, haven't since Carol, when Colin's department head, a man named Brody, found me. He was the kind of man who shakes hands like he means it. He said, "You're Sylvia's dad? She talks about you constantly. You're in insurance? Regional director," she said. I told him I'd retired 6 months earlier. He said, "Carol told me about your dad," and then stopped himself, embarrassed. "Sorry, I meant Sylvia. Sylvia told me." I told him it was all right. We talked for a while. Brody was good company. What I didn't know yet was that Colin had watched this conversation from across the room. What I didn't know was that there would be a consequence. The anniversary dinner was in February, Sylvia and Colin's 4th. I'd sent flowers to their house that morning, a standing arrangement Carol had started that I'd kept up after she passed. That evening, Sylvia texted me a photo of them in the kitchen. Renata had come for dinner, apparently, to celebrate with them. That was new. Or perhaps not new. Perhaps I'd just started noticing the inventory differently. The following weekend, Sylvia called again. Her voice had a different quality this time. Careful, constructed. She said Colin thought it might be a good idea if I came to Sunday dinners less regularly. "Not never," she said quickly. "Just give us a bit more space, as a couple." She paused. "He says he feels like there's a third presence at the table sometimes." I thought about Renata at the kitchen island the evening I'd brought the lamb. "A third presence," I said. "Dad, I heard you. Are you upset?" "I'm thinking." That night I did what I always do when I need to process something I can't fully articulate. I went for a walk. Long one. Down by the lake, the Oakville waterfront, cold February night, the kind that makes you feel like the only person on the planet. I walked for a long time. Carol used to say I did my best thinking in the cold. She was right about that too. I had dinner with my old colleague and friend Paul that Friday. Paul had gone through a bad divorce 7 years earlier and had the particular insight of a man who'd survived one. I told him what was happening. Not all of it. "Enough," he said. "Dave, what exactly are you waiting for?" I didn't have a good answer. What came next I will describe plainly, without drama, because it was not dramatic, it was methodical. It was in its own way, the most like myself I'd felt in years. I am a man who spent 3 decades in risk assessment. I understand documentation. I understand what it means to create a record of a pattern before that pattern reaches its consequence. I had been keeping notes. Not obsessively. In a small leather notebook I'd had since my first job, the kind of habit you develop when you work in an industry that requires precision. Dates, occasions. What was said, who was present. Not as evidence, at first simply as a record. The way I used to log client calls, not because I distrusted people, but because memory is fallible and details matter. I also called my financial advisor. This is the part I want to be very clear about, because it mattered enormously. Carol and I had been careful with our money over the years, not wealthy by any grand standard, but deliberate. We had RRSPs, a TFSA that had grown steadily over 15 years, a defined benefit pension from my company that I'd elected to defer until 60, and the house in Oakville, which by the spring of that year had a market value that would have startled both of us in our 30s. I had not reviewed the total picture since Carol's death. I had reviewed it piece by piece, separately, the way you sometimes avoid looking at the whole thing, because the whole thing includes her name. My advisor, a woman named Constance, who had known us both for 12 years, sat with me for 2 hours. By the end of that meeting, I understood exactly what I had, what it generated, and what I was entirely entitled to do with it, without anyone else's input. What I also understood was that I had, in a quietly significant way, been financing aspects of Sylvia and Colin's life in the years since Carol died. Not as loans, as gifts. In a total amount that would have surprised people who thought of me as simply Sylvia's father, the man in insurance or something like that. Not because I resented the giving. I didn't. I'd done it gladly. But I understood now the nature of what I was holding. The spring was quiet. I gave them the space Colin had requested. I did not go to Sunday dinners. I sent Sylvia a text on her weekly Thursday run to see how she was. I called on Sundays, at a time that didn't interfere with their evening. I was so scrupulously considerate about the space I was taking up that I became, in the architecture of their week, something close to invisible. And then they announced they were buying a house. Not their first house. They were selling the current one and buying something larger, in a neighborhood in Ancaster that I knew well. Good area. Older trees, bigger lots. The kind of streets where kids still ride bikes. I was glad for them, genuinely. I knew what it meant to put down roots in a place, and I wanted that for Sylvia. 2 weeks later, Colin called me directly. Unusual. He was warm on the phone, warmer than he'd been in a while, and he made a specific point of asking how I was doing, how the retirement was treating me, whether I was keeping busy. We talked for 12 minutes about nothing consequential, and then he mentioned the house. "We're just a bit stretched," he said, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed this. "The bridge financing is going to leave us short for about 6 weeks. Sylvia didn't want to ask, but I thought, between us, if you were in a position to help out temporarily, we'd obviously pay it back." The number he mentioned was not small. "Let me think about it," I said pleasantly. "Give me a few days." Of course. No pressure. I thought about Renata saying I was overdone. I thought about Colin sitting down without saying my name at the birthday dinner. I thought about Gareth and the breadbasket. I thought about Sylvia saying, "That's different," when I asked how often Renata was at the table. I thought about the walk by the lake in February and Paul asking what exactly I was waiting for. I called Constance. I reviewed the numbers again. Then I called Colin back. "I've thought it over," I said. "I'm not going to be able to help with the bridge financing." A pause. "Okay," he said carefully. "Can I ask why?" "I've been reassessing where I'm directing my resources in retirement," I said. "I want to be more deliberate about it going forward." Another pause. Longer. "Right," he said. "Sure, of course. Hope the purchase goes smoothly," I said. I meant it. He thanked me and got off the phone faster than he'd gotten on. The house purchase went forward. They managed the financing without me, which I had correctly assumed they would be able to. People always find a way when they need to. I knew that from 30 years of watching clients in tighter corners than a 6-week bridge loan. What happened next I learned through Sylvia, who called me 3 days after I'd spoken to Colin. "Dad," she said, and her voice had a quality I hadn't heard from her in a while. Not the constructed, careful voice. Something rawer. "Colin's mum is saying you're becoming difficult, that you're pulling away from the family on purpose to cause problems." I let that land. "Sylvia," I said. "When's the last time I called you first outside of Sunday?" She thought. "Thursday." "When's the last time I came over without being invited?" Silence. "When's the last time I stayed too long, or made either of you feel crowded?" Nothing. I want you to hold those answers for a minute," I said. "And then I want you to think about who's actually describing the situation accurately." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't know he'd called you about the money." "I know you didn't. Dad, I love you," I said. "That is constant. Everything else is conversation." I meant it as a comfort. I think she heard it as one. The thing about that conversation was what came after it. Not immediately. 2 weeks later, Sylvia called on a Thursday, not a Sunday, and her voice was different again. Not constructed, not raw, something more solid. She said, "Can I come over? Just you and me?" I said yes. She came with takeout from that Thai place we'd liked since she was in university. We sat at the kitchen table where she'd done her homework for 12 years, and she talked to me honestly for the first time in longer than I could pinpoint. She said, "I've been putting Colin first in a way that wasn't fair to you." I told her I understood. Second. She said, "Mum would have said something. I should have said something sooner." I agreed that Carol would have said something. I told her it was all right. I told her it wasn't really about the money. She said she knew it wasn't. We sat there for a while after the food was finished, just the two of us in the kitchen, and I thought about how Carol would have liked this Thursday evening, takeout containers on the table, Sylvia's coat still on the chair by the door, the way it had always been, that particular quality of quiet that means everything is okay. The house in Ancaster closed in June. I went to see it on a warm Saturday in July, at Sylvia's invitation. It was a good house, solid bones, good light in the kitchen, a backyard that would be excellent in the summer. I walked through it with her, while Colin and his brother moved boxes. Renata was there, in the kitchen, organizing a cabinet with the focused authority of a woman who considers other people's spaces her jurisdiction. She looked up when I came in. "David," she said. "Renata," I said. And that was the entirety of that. Later, when Sylvia and I were standing in the backyard looking at the yard, she leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. Just for a moment. The way she'd done when she was small and had been scared of something and needed to know I was there. "You okay, Dad?" "Outstanding," I said. She laughed. "I want to tell you what came 6 months after that, because it's the part that closed the chapter for me, quietly, without any scene-making or scorekeeping. I had, in the months after declining the bridge loan, done something I'd been delaying. I'd established a family trust. My financial advisor and estate lawyer had been recommending it for 2 years. Not a large or complicated thing. A vehicle for the house. For a portion of the investment portfolio. Structured correctly, so that the assets remained mine in every meaningful way, but would transfer efficiently, and in accordance with my wishes at the time of my choosing. Carol had wanted this. We'd talked about it before she got sick, and hadn't gotten around to it. As you don't when you assume there will be time. What the trust also meant, practically, was that the picture of what I had, and what I controlled, was no longer available to assumptions. You couldn't look at my life from the outside and estimate what was accessible, because it was structured rather than simply sitting there. This matters less, as a strategic move. I want to be honest about that, than as a clarification. I was no longer being managed. I was a man with a plan. Carol had always said I needed to be a man with a plan about the things that mattered. I was at a community dinner in November, a fundraiser for the Oakville Hospital Foundation that Carol had supported for years. I'd taken a table with Paul and some other old colleagues. Good evening, the kind where you remember that your life contains people and noise and good food, and you are glad for all of it. Gareth was there. I don't know why. Some connection through the guest list I didn't trace. He was at a table across the room and he saw me, and came over with the uncomplicated confidence of a young man who has never once considered that another person might not want to see him. "Hey David, didn't expect to see you here." I shook his hand. I did not owe him anything beyond that, and I knew it. "How are things?" he said. "Colin says you've been keeping to yourself lately." I thought of what I might say. Of several things I was fully entitled to say. I thought about the breadbasket and his observation about how Colin didn't talk about me much. "Things are excellent," I said, genuinely. "How are you doing, Gareth?" He told me. Apparently he had started a job in logistics. I listened for the appropriate duration. Then Paul tapped me on the arm about something, and I excused myself, and that was the end of Gareth. Paul said afterward, "You handled that well." "There was nothing to handle," I said. "That's what I mean. Here's what I'll tell you about the version of this that plays out in your head when you're in the middle of it. You imagine it will feel like something. Like victory, or justice, or at minimum, the satisfaction of a ledger balanced. You imagine there will be a moment where everything inverts, where the people who look through you suddenly see you, where the silence you received is returned, where the table gets turned with appropriate ceremony. That isn't how it works. What actually happens is quieter. One day, you're driving home along Lakeshore, and you realize you haven't thought about Renata in 6 days. You realize your Sunday calls with Sylvia have a warmth in them that had gone missing for a while and has come back. You realize you sleep without the background hum of resentment that you didn't even know was there until it stopped. 3 years after Carol died, I had assumed that most of what I was carrying was grief. Some of it was. A lot of it, as it turned out, was the sustained low-grade weight of being treated as peripheral in a room I'd helped build. When that weight lifted, I felt something I hadn't felt in longer than I could track. Not happy, exactly. Clearer than happy. Like the air the morning after a big storm. What I know now, and what I'll leave you with, is this. There is a kind of patience that looks like acceptance. And there is a kind of patience that is actually preparation. I had been practicing one of those for years and calling it the other one. The birthday dinner was simply the night I understood the difference. Renata had wanted me to feel small. Colin had wanted me to be convenient. Gareth hadn't given me much thought at all, which in its own way is the most honest category. What none of them understood, what I hadn't understood, until a February walk along the lake and a 2-hour conversation with Constance and a Thursday evening with Sylvia and takeout, was that I had never been peripheral. I had chosen, for reasons of love and patience and misplaced deference, to act as though I was. I stopped acting. I want to be clear that this isn't a story about money, though money appears in it. It isn't a story about revenge, though I'm willing to use the word. It's a story about a man who spent 3 decades assessing risk professionally, and then spent 4 years failing to apply a single one of those skills to his own life. Sylvia asked me recently, at Christmas, if I was happy. I told her I was. She gave me the look she gives me when she's deciding whether to believe something. Really, I said. She studied me for a moment. Then she nodded, the way she does when she's satisfied. Good, she said. Mum would be glad. She would have been. I poured myself a coffee. Nobody skips my cup anymore. And I sat down at the Christmas table in my daughter's new house in Ancaster, with the good light in the kitchen and the backyard full of snow, and I thought that Carol was right about most things, including this. You stop becoming a man who waits for permission to take up space, or you spend your whole life being managed by people who were never actually in charge. I stopped waiting. That was the whole of it, in the end.